Okay, good morning and welcome to the 21st meeting in 2020 of Scotland's Social Security Committee. And we have, hopefully we'll have a full house this morning. I've not received any apologies, and we will now move to agenda item 1, which is a decision on taking business in private. The committee will decide whether to item 3 in private, which is consideration of our new inquiry. Agenda item 2, the evidence we'll hear then. I'm going to assume, unless any member drops in the chat box, that we agreed to take item 3 in private. So is everyone agreed? Okay, we are agreed. Thank you very much. I'd also note that agenda item 4 that we have this morning is our pre-budget scrutiny considerations, and we've previously agreed to take that in private also, so that will be in private. And we now move to agenda item 2, which is COVID and social security. And the committee will take evidence from David Iser, Research Associate Fraser of Allender Institute, Siobhan Mathers, Trustee, Reform Scotland, and Tom Waters, Senior Research Economist, Institute for Fiscal Studies. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us this morning to give your thoughts in our first evidence session into this new inquiry. We will move straight to questions, and the first question will come from Tom Arthur.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to our panel today. The first question I would like to ask is a very general question, and I would like to invite each of the witnesses in turn to reflect upon the broader context of the economic crisis that we face, and in particular to situate the crisis we face over the coming months and beyond in relation to other economic and financial crises that were faced in recent years and decades. Where does the challenges that we face in the coming months relate to the challenges that we faced post-2008? So I'd like to open with that question. Perhaps if David would like to kick us off.
And just before, thank you, Tom, just before I bring David Iser in, I should have done a little bit of housekeeping. When we move through the questions, if witnesses are able to drop in the chat box if they're particularly keen to answer any particular question, just in case there's an instance where I don't bring all three witnesses in. But obviously for this first question, I'll be wanting to bring all of you in. So David Iser.
Good morning. Yes, very interesting question. I mean, this crisis is clearly unprecedented in the extent to which it's been created by this health pandemic, and it creates this, unique challenge in relation to what we think of as a traditional recession, because in this particular crisis, the economic challenge is created by the fact that we've necessarily had to shut down large sectors of the economy to control the spread of the virus, and so effectively what we've got is in sort of one way to think about this is that there's sort of two phases to this crisis. There's this first phase where we've got significant restrictions on economic activity, and then a big role for policy, not in stimulating the economy, which is what we traditionally start doing once we've got a recession, stimulating the demand side, but to support the economy through this period. And a big role for policy really in three sorts of things. One, in limiting the rise in employment as far as possible. Secondly, in supporting the incomes of those whose incomes have been affected by this shutdown. And thirdly, supporting individuals to be able to play their part in suppressing the spread of the virus. And at some point, we're going to move to a sort of what you'd think of as a sort of more traditional recovery phase, where once we're confident that the virus has been suppressed sufficiently, we can start doing the sorts of things that we traditionally think of when we come out of a recession, in terms of stimulating the demand side, doing lots of stuff on the supply side to upskill, reskill people, link them back to the labour market and so on. And those two policy phases are obviously not completely distinct. There's an overlap between them, but I think we're probably still more in that support phase than in the recovery phase. So the context is very different. I think your question was around situating this crisis in the context of other things that are happening. We've got used to, in the last few years, talking lots about uncertainty, and of course what we have here is uncertainty layered upon uncertainty layered upon uncertainty. So there's uncertainties around the spread of the virus over the future months. There's uncertainties around what level of restrictions we might need going forward to control that, uncertainties about the extent to which some of these changes in the economy will become permanent rather than just temporary, and uncertainties about how quickly the labour market will be able to sort of respond and adjust to those structural changes where they are more permanent. And on top of that, of course, we've got uncertainties around the end of the transition period for Brexit, still uncertainty about the future relationship with the EU layered on top of that.
Thank you, David. Siobhan?
Of what David says, in that this is an unparalleled crisis, and to underline, it's not just about the economic shock, it's about how we all live our lives. More working from home, having to be more careful about our health, etc. It was clear that the social security system has not been fit for purpose previously, and in Reform Scotland we would very much advocate a radical change in order to parallel the change that's happening in society. Our particular solution would be a universal basic income, and we think that now it would be an ideal time to do that, to actually harness that unparalleled change, that we're at a juncture just now not dissimilar to the end of World War II and the creation of the NHS. And so we think it goes way beyond economics, and if society is changing, then it's the role of the state to provide a safety net, to provide a backdrop in order to facilitate that change. And we don't believe that the current social security system is fit for purpose in order to guide the transition to a new normal in Scotland.
Thank you, Siobhan. And could I ask Tom to make a few remarks?
Thanks, yeah, and good morning to you all. So I think a few things I would add. So firstly, if you compare it to 2008, 2008 was not a high unemployment recession relative to other recessions. Unemployment certainly went up, but not by the kind of pace we'd seen in earlier recessions. At the moment, unemployment also hasn't gone up so much in this recession, but that's precisely because a lot of jobs are essentially on life support. And as we move forward, I think, probably reasonably expect unemployment to go up quite a bit, and we might expect that to be a really important difference relative to the last recession, which was more of a wages recession in many ways. And related to that, I guess, it's connected a bit to what David was saying, was in a standard kind of recession, you want people to be getting back into work as quickly as possible, and you don't want to do anything that kind of inhibits that in many ways. But it's precisely because of the nature of the health shock that's coming at the same time that, of course, we're not able to do that, and precisely that some parts of the economy are being shut down to make it more difficult to get into work. So that's a particularly unique situation that the government is handling the health side and the economic side at the same time, and to some extent they're in tension with one another. And then the last thing I'd flag as well is that from what we've seen so far, the increase in the government deficit, the national government is much larger than in past crises, and the deficit's now the largest it's been outside of world wars. And so I think certainly looking forward and thinking about the legacy of the crisis, that's going to be an important difference to some past crises.
Thank you very much, Tom. There's a huge amount in there, and lots that I would like to go on, but time restricts me. There's one point I do want to pick up on immediately, and that was a remark that David made. It was, as I understood it, a distinction between support and stimulus. Now, other colleagues on the committee are going to explore the issue of the UK government's social security response, but I would just like to ask David if he thinks there's been clarity in policy making between these distinct elements, support and stimulus. If I think, for example, of furlough or business grants, that seems very much as support, but then there were schemes such as Eat Out to Help Out, which seem more about with regards to as a form of stimulus. I would like to just ask David to reflect if he thinks there has been clarity in policy making between these two distinct elements, support and stimulus.
Well, I think, as I said, I mean, they're not two complete distinct phases. We don't wake up one day and say, right, okay, we've done the support stuff and now the virus is gone and we're back to stimulus. It's about managing the transition between those two things, and there's clearly going to be, while we hope that we're not going to go back to the scale of restrictions that we had in the period from April to June, there's clearly going to be a period, at least for several months, where restrictions will be still fairly significant. And so there is a fine line to tread, and both policies that continue the support phase, recognizing that some sectors are unable to go back to work, for example, whereas in other sectors things are able to, we've got better at managing the virus and the way it spreads, and so there's scope to sort of begin to move to some of the recovery phases. So it's not the case that there are two completely distinct phases, and some policy will contribute to both those elements. In hindsight, perhaps during the summer there was, a degree of over enthusiasm about where we were on that spectrum, possibly, and people will argue about the extent to which Eat Out to Help Out was a sensible policy at that time. But I think, for the next few months, the real emphasis is still going to be on that support side of things.
Thank you, David. My final question, and this is a big one, and I'd be keen to hear from all of our witnesses, if that's possible, convener, on this. And that is this question around what impacts do witnesses believe is the nature of the impact, temporary or structural? Do we believe that there's going to be change as fundamental in society as there was following the Second World War, I think, as Siobhan alluded to? Or do witnesses expect that this will just accelerate existing trends that predate COVID, such as digitisation, working from home? How fundamental a change do the members of the panel expect to see on the other side of this pandemic, and what are the implications for social security that will arise from that? And maybe if we started off with Siobhan.
I know that would be quite difficult. Siobhan, sorry to cut across you there. My apologies. I tried to come in before you started speaking. I'm now taking up time. I was going to say that would be a difficult question to respond to briefly, but we'll to all three witnesses in. But if you could try and be concise as possible, and I apologise in advance for having to say that. Apologies, Siobhan.
No problem. I totally understood. I think the answer is both, that it will throw up new issues and that it will accelerate existing issues such as digitisation, which you referred to. I think that there will be unintended consequences that we cannot even foresee as yet, and that therefore we need a social security system which provides the most flexible and secure backdrop as possible. I think that it's not all doom and gloom, that actually we should be quite upbeat is probably too strong a word, but just in a position to take advantage of necessary change in some ways, and that will require people retraining. It will require greater flexibility in jobs, and that is going to create hardship along the way as well. But I think a social security system can help to transition towards a new normal and to actually take advantage of changed attitudes and more of a willingness to embrace opportunities and change.
Tom?
I think that potentially, obviously, an enormous number of possible consequences. I think just one perhaps to pull out is this crisis will mean quite a large number of people have had interaction with the social security system, benefit system, than I've had in the past. I think it's possible that could have implications for people's attitudes towards the system, perhaps their kind of familiarity with it and keenness on using it. It's kind of a common thing that a lot of benefits are not taken up when people are entitled to them. I can imagine that changing. But I mean, I think in many ways the long run consequences of the crises are. That's kind of the $1 million question. I think is really anyone's guess.
Okay, David.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, there'll undoubtedly be a legacy of this crisis in terms of structural shifts in the economy. Preferences for business travel and traveling to the office and shopping online versus in shops is always, they're likely to change, but the extent of those changes is incredibly difficult to predict. And I'm not going to attempt to make any specific prediction on that. In terms of, what does this mean for the social security system? I think in many ways the crisis has really shone a light on many of the inadequacies in the system in the role it plays as a social safety net. And I'm sure we'll come on to some of that in more detail in the rest of the session. But there are a myriad of ways in which those issues could be addressed, from actually some fairly small but nonetheless important and significant changes that you could think about making, through to the very significant sort of thinking about the system as a whole that you could do. But those are all, of course, policy questions. They're in our hands as a society, and it's the extent to which people want those changes to happen and are prepared to make them happen.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And sorry, Mr. Arthur, we'll need to move on at that point. On the theme of the economic impact of COVID-19, which we were exploring there, a couple of questions I would like to ask. And Mr. Arthur was talking about the kind of potential realignment of the economy. We know how dreadful the social impact of job losses will be, but the opportunities within that realignment as well. So, for example, supermarkets, or at least their online platforms, seem to have been potentially the big winners in relation to some of that. Now, I wouldn't use that expression for those involved in health and social care, but we've seen that come to the forefront, and deficiencies in that brought into sharp focus in research and development. So you can see sectors within the economy that might be growing as a result of this realignment. So I'm just wondering, in terms of how this links to social security, for example, have you given consideration to what the pay and conditions and job security are in these growing and emerging sectors, on the basis that will have a direct link into the social security report that may be required in the future? So I'd appreciate any comments in relation to that, but also in Social Security we always talk about spend, or other committees might look at the taxing part of it. I was looking at some of the profits that the large supermarkets have been declaring, or reports suggesting they were going to be making. And the Scottish Government, for instance, had a large retailer levy, public health levy, I think it was called, a few years ago, which took in £95 million over 3 years using the rate system. So I'm just wondering, two parts to the question: do we have to do more in terms of making sure the paying conditions are strong and robust in the sectors that are emerging as the economy realigns? And for those sectors that are starting to show a strength because of that realignment, do we have to think about how we get some money in from those sectors to have the type of social security system that we all want to see? I know there's a lot in that as well, so we maybe take David Eisler first.
So, well, in terms of the second part of the question, so I think this is about broadly sort of recognition that there are winners and losers from this, and the extent to which we might try to raise revenues from those whose incomes have been sort of relatively protected, or who may have even sort of done relatively well during the crisis. Is that the number of it, that the second part of that question?
Well, obviously, we're thinking more about not the individuals that are working in that sector. I would want to make sure that the pay and the conditions of the workers within the sectors that might start to show a growth are protected. But in terms of any companies that might be making profits during the current economic crisis, whether those companies can be, we can maybe review. There's a review of devolved taxation at the moment the Scottish Government's got on, for example. That's whether or not more can be done to think about how these companies can be supported. But the flip side, actually, is how they can be taxed appropriately as well, quite frankly.
Yeah. So I think definitely the question of paying conditions. I mean, that's one of those issues that existed before this crisis in many sectors, and there were certainly issues around job security, issues around things like 0 hours contracts, and there's clearly a relation there between labour market conditions and the social security system, in the sense that where you have a labour market system that is creating jobs where pay is volatile, or where a lot of sort of temporary positions, if that goes hand in hand with a social security system that provides not a particularly strong safety net, both in terms of the sort of benefit rates that it pays, but also in relation to uncertainties around the extent to which people might be eligible for that support, delays in the application process, delays in getting those payments through, then you've got that kind of two layers of insecurity, and I think that's why we did see significant growth in levels of anxiety and feelings of insecurity. You've got to an extent, insecurity in the labour market. And rather than the social security system doing what it should do, which is being to sort of offset some of that, it's actually, in a way, a sort of second layer of insecurity, because it's not providing a particularly adequate safety net. The issue of what can be done potentially to raise revenues, a very interesting one. I haven't thought particularly so much on the business side of things, but clearly there's interest at a UK level, thinking about things like could we have new taxes, for example, on wealth, to address some of the issues that come out of this crisis. The Scottish Government does, of course, have already powers over income tax. And there's some interesting things to think about there in terms of the recognition that some people, or in fact quite a large number of people, their incomes have been relatively protected during this crisis, and the extent to which we should think about how we, in policy terms, might want to reflect on the implications of that.
Okay. Thank you. I know that was a lot to digest, but thank you for that. Siobhan, do you want to add anything there?
Yes, I think that there are two ways of looking at the change in employment patterns, and perhaps more jobs shifting from stable contracts to the so-called gig economy. One way of looking at it is to tighten up employment provisions and to outlaw such flexible new jobs. Scotland doesn't have the competence over employment law to do that, as far as I'm aware. And also, I think that a bit of flexibility is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as other factors can help to provide some security amongst employees in new jobs. And so therefore, realistically, in the interim, at least, it is possible that we'll be looking at more seasonal work and more part-time work. And again, I'm going to come back to the prospect of a universal basic income, perhaps providing more of a safety net and a backdrop to that sort of change. I'm not saying that everybody's going to move from a secure job in retail to working in an Amazon warehouse, or to driving a delivery van for supermarkets, but that seems to be the sort of new opportunities that we are seeing. There's also a question mark, obviously, about which companies are benefiting from this change, and how we tax that. We don't have competence over corporation tax in Scotland. There is a limit to what we actually could do in order to change that, and I think that there is a question mark as to what we actually should do as well. If we go in and say, right, these companies are making super profits out of this, let's tax them to the hilt, then that has implications for their ability to create jobs. So I think that we have to be quite careful about that, and we don't currently have the competence.
Siobhan, thank you. Before I bring Tom Waters in, I should just note, because I wouldn't have time to bring Paul McNeill or Keith Brown in, but in the chat box that accompanies this virtual meeting, both members have noted the mixed fortunes of the large retail sector, including, on the one hand, large profits for some, but redundancies for others. I think you nuancing that, Siobhan Mathers, is quite important. So thank you for that. I just wanted to deep check the comments we were getting in the MSP chat box there during that line of questioning. Tom Waters.
I don't have too much to add on this. I think on the tax side, the main thing I would flag is just that, so the deficit has gone up a lot during this crisis, and that is going to mean further down the road either raising taxes or reducing spending. I think the one thing worth keeping in mind when thinking about options for raising tax is, when we look at least at the level of the UK government, about 60% of revenues come just from three taxes, so VAT, income tax, and national insurance. And so if you want to raise significant amounts of money, that's kind of the most straightforward way to do it. And so something like corporation tax, I think it's only about 7% or so of revenue. So for raising, quite large sums, almost certainly both the UK government and the Scottish government would have to look to income tax, or in the case of the UK government, perhaps NICs or VAT as well.
Okay. Thank you. We'll move on now. Thanks to witnesses for that. And we'll actually go to our Deputy Convener next to open up on theme 2. Paula McNeill to be followed by Shona Robertson.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to talk about the employment job support schemes, which seem to have prevented higher levels of unemployment. I had two questions, maybe easier, Bob, if I just combine them. One is that there seems to be, something like 500,000 self-employed workers are still out of work, but it doesn't seem to be any support, and there hasn't been much attention paid to them, although I have had some people writing to me on it. And secondly, are you able to comment on what types of job schemes we should have in the future? And I'm thinking more not just about grant support or similar to the furlough scheme, but what types of schemes the government should have in mind in order to try and avoid what's an inevitable crash at some point in the future in terms of unemployment. Thank you.
Okay, so when we take Tom Waters in first, this instance, Tom.
Yeah, so I think on self-employed people being excluded, so the main grant self-employment income support scheme, there are several key groups who are ineligible for that. So it's those who have profits over £50,000, whose self-employment income makes up more than half of their income, and who essentially started their self-employment business in the last year or so, well, now 18 months, I guess. I think the key thing to keep in mind when thinking about this is those first two groups that excluded is very much a policy choice. So the government could have included those who, only get who get less than half their income from self-employment. They have sort of the means to do it, but that was a policy choice to not do that. For those who started their business more recently, I do think it is harder to think of a way that the government could reach those people because they haven't even submitted a tax return yet. It's not clear what what that kind of normal level of profit would have been in the absence of COVID. So I think it is harder to see what the government could have done there. Maybe they could have dreamt up some sort of scheme. And so I guess it's for those kinds of people where you're relying more on the standard means-tested benefit system. So you basically universal credit. And in there, the government has made a change which increases entitlements a bit for self-employed workers, and I saw just the other day they've just extended that for another 6 months. So I think that's the key differences between those two groups is those which the government kind of chose to not extend support to, and those that it is harder to see how they could have done
it. Siobhan?
I'd just like to briefly comment that I think that we should be looking for training support as much as for job support. I think that we should be focusing our efforts on retraining and upskilling the workforce, not just for the individual involved, but for society as a whole, that it's a public good to have a better trained, more nimble workforce for the new normal going forward.
David Isa?
So, on the self-employed, I agree with everything that Tom said. There's a sort of sense that while the job support scheme for employees has been pretty successful, that's not so much the case for the self-employed, although, as Tom said, there are sort of some additional challenges there. In terms of the question about, I guess this goes back to, the second part of the question goes back to that point about this transition from a sort of furlough scheme where we're saying, okay, well, sectors are either shut or demand is so low that we're basically supporting firms to keep employees in place so that we don't have a huge increase in unemployment and long-term scarring effects and so on. And at some point we sort of gradually move to more of this recovery phase, which is where we're sort of back into that more traditional economic recovery type of activities where, yes, it's not about offsetting the incomes of people who can't work as much as they used to, but it's very much about helping people upskill, reskill, and take up employment. Of course, when we move into that stage, we're more into the realms of areas where we're talking about devolved policy, and where what's more likely to happen is that the Scottish Government will get uplifts in its block grants, reflecting what's happened at a UK level, but it has more flexibility and autonomy in some cases to determine policy in Scotland.
Pauline, do you want to come back in any of that?
Yeah, just quickly, if we could come back to what Siobhan said about the importance of training, which David also mentioned, but to cut to the point, Siobhan, in your view then, should there be an audit of further education training, for example, given it's quite an important sector, and perhaps should there be something quite radical here around, I don't know, some right, a voucher for every single person to retrain, or is there any one single thing that you think needs to change in order to provide that training for people who may have to retrain in a new job?
I think I wouldn't advocate one particular solution. I think that we need to be flexible and nimble about it. I think that the further education and higher education sector has a huge role to play, and perhaps more vocational strengthening vocational training at secondary level as well. I think that nimbleness is the key. My fear is that public policy responses lag the requirements of the economy, and if we have ever seen a phase where public policy has had to adapt really, really quickly, and I do not envy Rishi Sunak in having to essentially make up schemes like overnight in order to support change, and it's not always got right. But I think that just being able to adapt and look at what is needed, I think it's an area that does require a fair bit of an analysis, and I don't have all the answers, but having a better toolbox to throw at emerging problems, I think, is something that Scotland will require.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Shona Robertson.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel. So we've touched on a little bit of this. I want to focus a bit more on the likely impact on both reserved and devolved social security spend if the job support schemes end as is planned next April. I mean, first of all, do you think they should end in April, or should they continue along the lines that other European countries have said that they'll continue their version of these schemes well into next year to avoid that cliff edge? And if so, how should that be done? Should there be some kind of softer landing where there is a kind of phasing out? So first, that's the first question. Maybe start with Tom.
So I think the key thing here is it just depends so much on the extent of the recovery, and so April seems like a long way away in the current world, and the kind of the path that the government looked like they were taking before the long starting today was something a bit more like a phasing out. We're going to move from the job retention scheme to the job support scheme, and the job retention scheme itself have become a bit less generous over time. And so I guess you could have imagined that being kind of continued to become a bit less generous and phased out. Something like that does seem kind of fairly sensible to me. But kind of predicting now what should be happening in April, I think doesn't seem very sensible, in the sense that we don't really know what the recovery is going to be looking like then. And if the labour market's looking very strong, then obviously that strengthens the case for paring back these schemes more quickly. Whereas if the labour market's really weak, then the reverse. So I think perhaps the key thing is that the government is relatively kind of nimble with these schemes and sets them according to those labour market conditions.
So really what you're saying is they may have to review the April deadline, as they've done obviously with the furlough scheme so far. Any of the other rest of the panel? Siobhan, what's your view?
Well, my long-term view is that we'd be better placed if we had a universal basic income instead of the eternal tinkering which we currently see, that it would be a better tool to adapt to the unprecedented situation of uncertainty we currently face. But in the short term, I think that need to be wary of propping up jobs that aren't going to be there in the long term, and it's a matter of how do you a fine line between supporting individuals who need an income and not throwing money at sectors, at jobs that aren't going to exist in the long term, and focusing on transitioning towards the new normal, how the economy is going to operate.
Okay, thank you, David.
I mean, the support has to be conditional on what's happening in relation to the virus and the extent of the restrictions that are needed. April is clearly a long way away, and it's very difficult to predict what will be happening there. But it seems to me likely that there'll still be some form of restrictions in place, particularly around leisure and hospitality. And we know that those are sectors where, even in October, furlough rates were still pretty high. Overall, about 10% of employees still on furlough in October, and to the extent that quite a lot of those were in leisure and hospitality sectors. And to the extent that it seems likely that there's still going to be some restrictions, some lack of demand in April, you'd hope that, or you'd expect that policy is going to have to respond to that. There's actually no point in saying, well, we're going to have policy X in April when we really have little idea really about what might be happening in April. So there's a need to be sort of flexible and responsive on that front.
Thanks for that. I mean, obviously one of the concerns is, or the big concern, I think, in terms of impact on social security spend would be initially the impact on universal credit, but also if you look at then the follow-on impact potentially to the Scottish Government budget through the passporting of that benefit into entitlement of devolved benefits that are essentially then demand-led. Do you have a concern about the restrictions of the Scottish Government's ability to respond to that? If you have a demand-led budget within a fixed budget with very limited borrowing powers, clearly that is it's potentially a big concern. Is that something the panel would share? Maybe start with David.
So I think clearly what we've already seen is a fairly significant increase in universal credit claims, and that's likely to continue to increase. Although the furlough scheme has been very effective in limiting the increase in unemployment, of course, quite large numbers of people who have been furloughed, particularly the low paid, were furloughed on less than full pay, and some people who weren't furloughed also have seen pay fall. And so even though unemployment's not increased substantially so far, then those universal credit claims have increased and are likely to continue to increase over the next few months. In terms of what that means for devolved social security expenditure, one of the big impacts that this will have is in relation to the Scottish Child Payment, which eligibility for is linked explicitly to UC eligibility. So if claims for universal credit increase, then demand and expenditure on that benefit will increase. So that is a risk. The latest forecasts from the Fiscal Commission sort of take into account the slightly rise in universal credit, but I think there's still a risk that spending increases above that. I mean, having said that, in the scheme of things, forecast expenditure on that benefit next year is around 80 million. So even if that increased by 50%, that's an additional 40 million. And in the scheme of things, that in itself isn't a huge financial challenge, wouldn't be a huge financial challenge for the Scottish Government. In terms of the big payments that are now devolved around disability, illness, so DLA, PIP, attendance allowance and so on, those are virtually all associated with the block grant adjustment, which, to cut a long story short, basically means that as long as demand for those in Scotland mirrors increased demand in the rest of the UK, then there's an offsetting effect through the block grant there, and that shouldn't cause substantial undue concern at this stage, I don't think. But so that there are risks, but they're manageable risks at this stage, I think.
Okay, anyone else want to come in? No.
But the social security system was overly complex and problematic, prior to COVID and prior to devolution of some welfare powers. It's become even more complex now, and in Reform Scotland, we would advocate devolving all welfare powers to the Scottish Government. That, of course, becomes more problematic when we don't have borrowing powers, and that an increase in that competence would also have to be looked at in order to properly implement strengthened devolved policy powers.
Thank you. That's fine. That's all from me, convener. Thank you.
Thank you. And just before I bring Rachel Hamilton in, just for a point of information, just for anyone listening, in relation to David Iser's comments about the other benefits that come through block grant adjustments, such as the disability benefits, both the Social Security Committee and the Finance and Constitution Committee have prepared a report where we do actually have some concerns in relation to the demographic differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and what that could mean for block grant adjustments. And obviously the fiscal framework is being reviewed going forward in the future, so it's just to put some of that on the record. Can I take Rachel Hamilton now, please?
Yeah, it was just to follow up a point that some of the witnesses made with regard to the economic scarring. I just wondered what their view was on whether it was better for government to put taxpayers' money into creating jobs, possibly creating new green jobs, or for the government to attempt to protect jobs. And David Iser spoke about the hospitality sector, where we know that there could be long-term economic scarring as far down the line as 2023 for recovery, as predicted by UK Hospitality this morning. And we know that obviously the short-term working contracts are being put in place to keep those jobs, but that, of course, there are loads of jobs on furlough still. So it's kind of, from an economic point of view, what is the best way forward? And that question could be perhaps to David to start.
That's helpful, Rachel. Thank you. David Iser.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. It's a very difficult one to answer, given the the uncertainty about the extent to which various changes that we've seen so far will become permanent or might be temporary, and so on. But clearly, I think there is a role for government to think about where there will be an increased demand for employment. Social care is an obvious one, and thinking about its role in relation to training and employing directly in sectors like that, and in the green economy as well. And of course, we'll no doubt see what we always see as we come out of recessions is a big increase in capital spending at some point in an attempt to stimulate the employment recovery as well. So there's definitely a balance between these things. It's very difficult, I have to say, to sort of make firm predictions about how to balance these various challenges.
Anyone else?
I'm not seeing. Do you have a follow-up question, Rachel, perhaps, or witnesses might want to give a bit of consideration? I don't know if you want anything you want to add, Rachel.
I'm going to comment on theme 5. It was just a supplemental on that point, really. Thank you.
That's fine. I'll bring you back in at theme 5. Keith Brown.
Convener, is around the point that David Eisler was making earlier on about uncertainty layered on uncertainty, and really the issues of what certainty we have to live with and what we can do without. And it was the point that if people are secure, that they're more likely to involve themselves in economic activity. We saw that through the 2008 recession subsequently. It's really about the point about social security and job security. And the interrelationship between the different governments. If you have, for example, the current controversy over the furlough system, whether it applies, we still don't know the answer, if that will apply in Scotland. Should Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland go into a lockdown, if it will apply, and if it will apply at the same rate? That kind of uncertainty feeds right through to people's willingness to, take on commitments, to be involved economically and so on as well. And to the extent it has a detrimental impact, one example, I think those people at Peterhead Football Club were made redundant at the weekend because it was expected the furlough was going to finish. To the extent it has an impact, it obviously increases social security spending, and all of which, of course, the Scottish Government's responsible for. But I suppose it's the way that the current system, whether it's through job security or social security, is not trying to take a whole system approach, and it can't do because of the way things are currently constrained. I just wondered if there was any comment that David in particular, but other members of the panel would have on those issues.
David Eisler?
I think it is obviously sort of challenging that we've got this very evolving situation, and policy, as we keep saying, has to be responsive on the one hand. On the other hand, it's true that uncertainty doesn't help, and it's been rather unfortunate how we saw in October some initial proposals for a job support scheme that were then revised within a couple of weeks, and then shortly after that we had a complete sort of shift back to something very similar to the original furlough after all. And yes, I mean, I agree that some of that very short-term policy changes certainly not been very helpful, and there does seem to be some evidence that there have been some layoffs that could have been prevented because of those delays. The sort of revised job support scheme, not the first one that was proposed, but the second one. There was an element of that which I thought was framed quite well, which is that the so-called job support scheme closed in brackets was designed to provide support for firms that were legally required to close by any of the 4 governments of the UK. And so, regardless of what you thought about whether that scheme in itself was well designed or not, the framing of the policy at least seemed to sort of take into account the fact that the decisions about restrictions are made by 4 different governments, but the support itself was conditional on those decisions that the governments had actually made. So if the Scottish Government decided that it was necessary to close a particular sector, and that was different from the decision that the UK Government had made for England, then actually this a policy worked in such a way that, well, the support would be available for those Scottish businesses, even if those hadn't been shut in England and vice versa. And it seems to me that it would be sensible to try to frame furlough policies in that way. So we had something that said, well, okay, furlough is, this level of furlough is available in any part of the UK when there is a full lockdown. This level of furlough is available in any part of the UK for businesses who are legally required to shut by any government in the UK. That sort of framing would seem to sort of help in creating some of that certainty, but still being conditional on the level of the restrictions that have been imposed.
I know that Tom's not coming in here. Siobhan, can I just check? Do you want to add anything to
that? Just to stress that the mismatch between public health, Scotland having public health powers, but not the economic and social security powers to back up public health decisions, is deeply problematic, and has highlighted a situation which has existed for quite some time, that a crisis quite often is useful, so to speak, in highlighting flaws in a system.
Okay, thanks, Siobhan. Keith, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'll come back to it later. It was just about the fact that it's about security. If people aren't feeling financially secure, the impact it has on the economy. But no, I'm fine with that just now, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I know we're taking our time to get through the themes. There was a lot of interesting themes through it too. And I'm also conscious this is a social security inquiry, not an economy committee inquiry. But I'm going to ask just one more question on theme 2. And I'm not stealing the question from the toes of my colleagues that want to go into theme 5, but I suppose there is a connection. And what I'm wanting to ask about is, for those who have benefited through furlough on 80% of their wages, because that depends whether they were minimal wage or they were more well paid within the economy to begin with. Is there any modelling work in relation to the demand that's kept in the economy more generally? So the benefit of having someone on 80% furlough and their spending power within, okay, a limited economy, but is furlough not only retaining their jobs potentially, but also by them still having a spending power, allows them to sustain other jobs in the economy that otherwise might mean other people end up on benefits? And I suppose you can make the same point in relation to the additional money in UC, the £20 supplement. Does that have additional cash being spent in the economy that could sustain people in employment that otherwise might see those other individuals become having to access social security? If there's not any modelling work around that, fine, but I'm just wondering if there is anything that's been done in relation to that. I don't know if any witnesses, any information on that. David Iser?
So I think one of the things that's I mean you're right that as well as providing critical support at an individual level, schemes like this have wider economic benefits as well. Although with the caveat that the furlough scheme was largely designed not as something to sort of keep demand up high or stimulate demand. It was really, it was very much a policy that was aimed at supporting incomes. And we will, of course, move to that sort of more traditional stimulus phase. And one of the things that's interesting, or that has come out of this crisis, is that there has been a huge increase in household saving, of course, but that's very much been concentrated, or not concentrated, but household saving is something that higher income households have been able to do, because although in some cases incomes have fallen for households higher up the income distribution, spending has fallen much less, because frankly there's much less that people can spend their money on, On the other hand, we do have some evidence that the people who were on furlough on less than full pay tended to be at the lower paid end of the spectrum. So lower paid jobs were more likely to receive less than full pay than higher paid jobs on furlough. And what that means is that, and for those lower paid people, they have less non-essential spending that they can cut. And so that has meant that, that's why their challenge has been particularly great, and has meant that they're often running down savings or running up debt.
David, thank you. I'll just leave that question hanging, but if any of the witnesses, as we go through our inquiry, were clearly interested to know the impact on the economic decisions that have been taken by governments, what that impact will have on social security, which was the reason for asking that question. But David, I think your points brings us nicely on to the next theme, and I'll bring Alison Johnson in at this point.
Good morning, witnesses, and thank you, and thank you, convener. I'd just like to have a couple of questions, if I may, on the impact this has had on specific groups of people. House of Commons library briefing on the labour market impact towards the end of October noted that workers who are from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background, women, young workers, low-paid workers and disabled workers have been most negatively impacted by the coronavirus outbreak. So I'd just like to, I'd be grateful if you could elaborate on the extent to which COVID has changed the demographics of those in financial difficulties and the implications that has for both devolved and reserved social security.
Siobhan Mathers, shall we perhaps go to yourself? I see you scribbling down some notes there. Siobhan, shall we go to yourself first perhaps?
Yeah, I've seen that research as well, and it's certainly worrying about how COVID seems to be exacerbating existing problems for the groups which you mention. And I would repeat what I previously said, that the current social security system does not appear to be nimble enough to be able to respond to particular requirements amongst particular groups, such as women, young people, Black and ethnic minorities, the disabled, and universal basic income, which I know that I'm not having to tell anything new to the Greens about this one, but that we believe would help in adapting to it. I think a lot more research needs to be done, and government needs to be responding in a much more timious fashion to particular demographic challenges.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else would like to respond to that, convener.
Of course, yeah. Paul?
Thanks. Yeah, I think I'll just say a couple of things about that. So, Steve, when we look at the labour market, everything said, Alison, I think is right. Lower earning workers particularly more likely to be affected, for example, and that doesn't just necessarily have a consequence for right now, but also for those longer term scarring effects. We know from previous recessions that remaining out of the labour force for a long period of time can have long run consequences, and so we might worry about beyond just the next few months or however long. I think when you look at any implications for social security, certainly at least for reserved social security, you kind of get a somewhat different picture. So there's been a bit of a shift towards in some ways at least, there's been a bit of a shift towards more advantaged groups. So new claimants to universal credit, for example, would be more likely to own their own home, to have a degree, to have done a high-skilled occupation in the past, and that they're less likely to be disabled. And so that connects to the fact that the recession is affecting people kind of across the income distribution. And I think that's potentially important in the sense that when the economy recovers, it means that the DWP might want kind of to take a different approach to helping those people get back into work, to the kind of caseload that they would have had before the pandemic. And so I think it's certainly at least when we're looking at those at universal credit and the reserved benefits, I think you get a somewhat different picture to when you're looking kind of just at the labour market effect.
Okay,
David Isaac. Sorry, Alison, on you go.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I'm just, I'm asking David if he'd like to comment.
I mean, nothing much to add. I think a number of studies have sort of reiterated the findings that you highlighted in terms of those groups. The labour market side of this crisis has been very much one that has hit people that were already working in low-paid sectors. The extent to which that continues over the next few months is not entirely clear. It's not a degree of uncertainty as with anything. But I think, clearly, if you look at where unemployment was starting to rise and where there were still large numbers, relatively large numbers on furlough schemes, then there's clearly likely to be further strain, particularly on the young, who are much more likely to be furloughed in the height of the lockdown, and are still more likely to be on furlough in October, and more likely to work in those sectors that are very much restricted under social distancing. So I think the young in particular is an area where clearly a group that are badly affected by this.
I mean, the Resolution Foundation they've commented on the most affected workers as being those in hospitality, leisure and other sectors affected directly by lockdown. But they note that differences may be reducing, saying that while the effects of the crisis so far have been borne heaviest upon the youngest and low paid, it seems likely that it will become more widely spread over time. And the charity Step Change, they have found that 45% of their new clients citing coronavirus as a reason for their debt problems are actually single with no children. You spoke earlier about upskilling and reskilling, and I mean, I suppose you're speaking about the fact that our job centres and the DWP may be working with people that previously might have had little contact with them. I mean, I know one thing this crisis has done is it's made many more people aware of how difficult it can be to survive on universal credit, for example, people who never thought they'd find themselves relying on it. But do you think there is an optimal way? I mean, obviously, yes, my own party strongly supports a basic income. Do you think there's an optimal way that we can tie in the work the DWP is doing with that of future work?
Sorry, the silence there is that I thought someone was going to come in. David Iser, should we take you first? And can I just remind the witnesses as well, if they're particularly keen to come in, they can drop a little note in that box. David Iser.
Well, I think there are a number of elements to that question. I think. I mean, one is around the adequacy of the safety net, and I think there's a strong case for saying that the safety net in the UK is particularly weak by international standards. There are questions about sort of the extent to which people who are out of work in our social security system are coerced to find work, which I think needs to be looked at. And there's an element of the question which is about how do we link up the the work that the DWP does in terms of administering benefits with wider support that people need to help them access work. And that's one area where there has been some work done in the past to sort of try to better link up and align social security system with employability services and training services, but that's something that clearly needs to be continually reviewed.
Thank you.
Don't see any other witnesses indicating they want to come in. Alison, did you have any further questions?
No, I'm content for now, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy Balfour.
Good morning, Convener. Actually, sorry, just to say that I think Alison has covered the points that I wanted to raise, so I'm happy just to move on, if that's okay.
And we'll take in at theme 5, Jeremy. Thank you very much. So we'll move to theme 4 and we'll take Shona Robinson to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Shona Robinson.
Thanks very much, Convener. The panel will be aware of some of the temporary changes to social security that have been made by the UK government. So in summary, we touched on earlier the £20 increase to universal credit and working tax credit, the suspending the minimum income floor, the raising of local housing allowance and restoring the link to current rents, and finally the suspending of conditionality. So quite substantial temporary changes. I guess the question is, should those changes continue beyond April? And do the panel share my concern that there's these temporary changes were brought in for essentially those who were coming in contact with the social security system maybe for the first time, and does it not smack a little bit of the sort of deserving and undeserving poor, that those who were on universal credit or requiring a housing benefit previously were somehow expected just to manage? And do you think this was brought in a bit to kind of soften the blow of those who were coming in contact with the social security system for the first time, who may well have been shocked by what they found if they've never relied on social security benefits before? So I guess, what do the panel think about that? And do you think these temporary measures, albeit welcome temporary measures, to continue beyond the April deadline? Maybe to Siobhan. Sorry, just to.
Apologies, Siobhan. It's just that Tom had dropped in the chat box. He was keen to come in first in this one, so we'll take Tom and then go on.
Thanks. So yeah, let me talk about the temporary measures. So I think that I would very much split the temporary measures. The ones relating to local housing allowance or housing benefit and the minimum income floor from the £20 a week one. So I think the £20 a week increase, in many ways, it's a standard kind of increase in benefits, makes the system more extensive, it costs more, it increases incomes for low income households, and it's quite a sort of a standard benefit change. Whether you think that that's a good idea for the long run or not, I think that kind of just depends about what you think about the right level of redistribution. I guess I don't have a professional view on that. In terms of the other two, I think things are actually a little more subtle. So when you look at the local housing allowance, before the system we had before meant that the amount of housing benefit you could get or support for housing universal credit was based on the rents in your area back in 2012. And I think that had become bizarre and was becoming increasingly bizarre, that you could live in an area where rents have grown really quickly since 2012, and now it's actually quite an expensive area, but you're still, the maximum amount of housing benefit you can get was still based on those old rents or connected to those old rents. So I think the temporary change the government made there is very much a welcome one to actually restore that link. And I'm not 100% sure whether or not the government are going to continue or not. It seems like they made some indications that they might. But some sort of link between the amount of housing benefit you can get and how expensive the area you live in seems like a sensible one. Certainly more sensible than linking it to rents 10 years ago, 8 years ago. The minimum income floor, I think the minimum income floors, so the way it works is if you're on universal credit and you're self-employed, you're treated as earning the minimum wage, even if you actually earn less. I think the point of it is partly kind of an anti-fraud measure. So to stop people kind of declaring low or disincentivize people from declaring low levels of earnings when they actually earn a bit more. And secondly, to encourage people who are on low levels of earnings, who in self-employed, who aren't kind of who aren't making much, to get an employee job if they're able to do that instead. Now, given in the middle of the crisis, when there weren't essentially any vacancies, that rationale for minimum income floor was clearly undercut. And so I think it was fairly sensible for the government to suspend it. It's less clear to me that in the future, in the long run, when we're kind of back to normal, whatever exactly that means, that suspending it would permanently be as good an idea. And so I think really what the government wants to do there is to make that policy sensitive to the state of the labour market. And they have just 1 or 2 days ago, they've said they're going to extend the suspension for another 6 months, which looks pretty sensible given that the England's going into a lockdown now, and the rest of the UK as well is having similar situations. So I would make a bit of a distinction on those ones there. I've talked for long enough now, I'll stop now.
Okay, no, that's fine. Siobhan Mathers.
I think that there has been consistent short-term thinking on behalf of the Treasury, short-term thinking and wishful thinking. I think that they come up with policies for as short a time as they think that they can get away with, but it's quite clear that this crisis is going to have much more long-term enduring effects. I think it certainly does. The changes certainly do need to be extended, and given that we had a not very generous welfare system in the beginning, I think that the £20 increase is going to have to stay in place for quite a while. But it won't surprise you to hear that I think that we should be transitioning away from the existing system and towards a universal basic income anyway, whether that is on a UK basis or on a Scottish basis, and that would provide a much better safety net in the long term, rather than tinkering with a universal credit system, which, despite the fact it is new and supposed to change things, just does not work.
And David Isa.
There's lots of arbitrariness, I think, in some of the existing UK social security system. I certainly think the £20 increase to UC, there's a very strong case for that becoming permanent. I mean, that really just undoes some of the real terms cuts since 2015, which were always on the base of something that wasn't particularly generous in the first place. But there's an inconsistency in increasing the limit there by £20, but not doing anything about some of the legacy benefits like JSA. So that needs to be addressed. And as Tom said, the change to housing benefit is really just addressing a sort of fairly nonsensical change that had been made a few years ago that delinked housing benefit from local rents. So it makes sense to keep that one in place. There are other arbitrarinesses, though. The benefit cap is basically arbitrary, the 2-child limit. So there are a number of inadequacies there or inconsistencies that are worth looking at. I don't know if we're dealing now with the longer term issue that was raised at the end of that as well. I'll keep my answer there to those specific things.
Rona?
Yeah, well, just on that longer term kind of new thinking, Siobhan has mentioned a few times the idea of universal basic income, something I fully support, and it's gained a lot of traction. But I guess more generally, my question would be, the more people have been exposed to the social security system in a way they've never been before. Do you think that there is more of a public understanding now and less stigma around social security, given that level of exposure and the exposure of the fragility of kind of household incomes? And do you therefore think there may be more public support for more kind of radical new thinking about social security than perhaps there was previously, because of that interaction with the system and just the COVID backdrop in itself? So maybe start with David, who I think was going to say something about long term.
I mean, I have seen some evidence that there's some evidence of attitudinal shift, somewhat more in favour of redistribution and a more generous safety net. The longer term, I mean, we've talked a bit about universal basic income. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that specifically. Well, before I do that, I mean, I think what this crisis has really shone a light on, I think, is some of the inadequacies in the existing UK social security system. Most of which were well known about already, but at fairly meagre levels of benefit for those out of work by international standards. This sort of emphasis on coercion, conditionality in relation to the out of work moving into employment, and a degree of sort of significant degree of uncertainty around the whole sort of process of applying for the main out of work and low income benefits, and some quite stringent means tests on the income side and on the capital side. So I think there is a case for addressing all of that. Whether UBI is the answer, I think, is a slightly different question, which we can pick up on if you want to.
I mean, I think if you want to put on record, if you think there's an alternative longer term solution, or your views on UBI briefly, I think we're a bit short of time, but if you wanted to put on the record what you think should be what we should be focusing in longer term.
Well, I mean, I think a UBI potentially addresses some of those criticisms that I just mentioned, and particularly, I think the key one for me, the key advantage. I mean, the supporters of UBI will raise a number of potential advantages. I think the key one for me is the way that the certainty of that income, the security that brings, has a number of benefits. It means effectively it can help potentially redress some power imbalances between employers and employees. It means that people out of work don't necessarily have to take the first job that comes along if that doesn't suit them, if it's low paid, if it's not particularly good quality. It means that people have a degree more incentive flexibility to move employer, even if that means a temporary period where they are not earning. And all of that kind of potentially creates a sort of virtuous circle where it helps to improve paying conditions in jobs because of those facts. I think the key problem with the UBI, as many people have pointed out, is the sheer cost of it. If you pay it to everybody in society, it means that even a relatively low level of UBI can cost a huge amount. And in fact, at the Fraser Rounder Institute, we did some modelling on this last year, and we found that even a UBI that was basically paid at the same level of JSA, costs sort of 27 billion pounds. Now, of course, you can recoup some of the costs of that by turning off various existing benefits, getting rid of the personal allowance and income tax and so on, but you're still left with a pretty big funding gap, and that's for a policy that actually is no more generous for those out of work than the existing one. So it doesn't necessarily address all of the challenges that we might want to address, and in fact, it's an expensive way of addressing some of them. We might be better thinking about how we make the existing system more generous and remove some of the focus on the conditionality, and think about how we can sort of improve some of the existing systems' responsiveness to income volatility, rather than the full UBI. The other thing to say about the full UBI, of course, is that it's with all the will in the world, it's not something that we're going to be able to implement in time to deal with this particular crisis. It might be good to have in place for the next crisis whenever that comes along. Although, of course, the final thing to say is even if we'd had a UBI when this crisis hit, that would have helped a lot in terms of reducing anxiety, providing certainty and security to people in terms of not having to make an application for universal credit and wait to see what the outcome of that application was, but it wouldn't have substituted for something like the furlough scheme anyway, because the furlough scheme is very much about maintaining employment, keeping people attached to employers and so on, and clearly a UBI wouldn't do that either.
Okay, thank you.
I know we're running out of time, but Siobhan, you've mentioned universal basic income a couple of times in your evidence. I just want to give you it's a very brief opportunity, but do you want to come back in at any point, Siobhan, before we move on?
Yes, briefly. I think that there is a useful opinion window at the moment, as Shona Robeson has alluded to, that there are more people have been in contact with the social security system. They have seen that things are changing very rapidly, and there is a need for a more reliable safety net than we have. And so I think that the work should be done now in order to progress universal basic income. I would disagree with David Iser on that we should work with the existing system. I think that the existing system of universal credit and the myriad other benefits has been discredited and does not work. I think we do need to move to something totally different. I and Reform Scotland are not fixed on one particular UBI scheme. There are many, many different ways to do it. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it means a vastly complex change in tax and spend. But I think that we can't afford not to address this and look at either on a Scottish basis or a UK basis a totally new social security system moving forward.
Okay. And thank you. And just before we move on to Paul McNeill, I've got a very brief question I want to ask. And I feel compelled to ask, because if I don't ask it, I think my constituents would quite rightly call me out on this. So universal credit claimants in Scotland since lockdowns increased by 213,000. We currently have the £20 per week uplift in universal credit. During COVID, many of my constituents were on low fixed incomes on universal credit before COVID and very excluded from the workplace and struggling to get that first foot on the employment ladder in a way that was affordable. What message would it send out to those constituents of mine and others right across Scotland who were struggling in universal credit if that £20 additional payment was to be taken away once we're out the other end of COVID-19? Could that potentially have a really, really dreadful consequence in sending out that there's a two-tier benefit system? There's those that are caught up in the benefit system just now who deserve additional support, but those that have been struggling with the benefit system for a long, long time don't deserve that support. I think my constituents would be asking that question if I didn't put that on the record. That's not addressed to any individual witness, but I wonder if anyone would like to comment on that. Siobhan, I can see you.
It seems to make no sense to me. I think it's totally unfair, and I think that a universal basic income would get rid of that sort of conditionality and differences in circumstances. It's unfair. It doesn't make sense.
Thank you. I won't ask anyone else to come in on that. I felt I had to ask that. For a lot of my constituents who have been unfortunately benefit dependent and really struggling to get into work before COVID hit. Quite frankly, Pauline McNeill.
Bob, I know you're short of time, so I'm happy to pass if you've only got short time. I don't mind.
Let's see if we can take you in at the end if there is time. Then we'll move on to our final theme, and we'll take Jeremy Balfour first, and then it's Rachel after that.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your time so far. I just wonder if you could comment on a couple of things around the Royal Social Security. Clearly, the initial plan had been that all devolved benefits would now have been up and running and being administrated by the agency. Now, due to government delay, that hasn't happened. But I wonder if they had been, do you think it would have made a difference? And what differences do you think Scottish Government could or would have done than has happened at present? I'm happy for anyone to pick that up.
David Isa.
It's an interesting sort of counterfactual question. I mean, the timing, to the extent that the timing of this could ever have been good, the timing's been particularly unfortunate in terms of how it's fallen in relation to the transfer of the new powers to Social Security Scotland. And it's very unfortunate that in particular the child payment, which in a way is sort of Scotland's sort of flagship policy to address some of the challenges around low incomes, is at a stage where it's only beginning to be, or about to begin to be, rolled out, and that's unfortunate. Obviously, if this pandemic had come in a few years' time and those benefits were already being delivered entirely by Social Security Scotland, then there could be more thinking about changing rates, tweaking eligibility, that sort of. Well, there's actually a caveat around that point, but it is very unfortunate. There's a question about the extent to which the government just accepts those timescales, or whether it tries to do something in the meantime. But it's an interesting question as to what might have been done differently. But it's if the crisis had come in a few years' time, but a difficult one to answer.
Siobhan Mathers, do you want to comment on
that? I would agree with what David said. I've got nothing else to add.
Okay. I notice Tom hasn't dropped anything in the chat box, but very briefly, Tom Waters, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, nothing particular to add to that.
Okay, Jeremy, do you have a follow-up to Your question?
So within the submissions, there's been quite a large call that we should move and get these devolved benefits run here in Scotland as soon as possible. Would you join with that call, and do you think it would be beneficial if we can get these benefits devolved quicker than what the present government team is suggesting?
I'll take bids from witnesses who wants to come in on that. Tom Waters.
My instinct is it depends a lot on what the Scottish Government exactly wants to do. So I mean, things like topping up existing benefits in terms of just making the system more generous. If you say want to like top up universal credit payments for those out of work, for example, then that would be a particular policy choice, and it'd be one that, as I understand it anyway, top-ups the Scottish Government can do as things stand. I think the only case in which the case in which you'd want to have many more devolved benefits would be if you want to make really kind of quite large structural changes to the benefit system to make it operate in a substantially different way. I guess we can perhaps we can get into that. So I mean, I think it's in that kind of situation where you think like that actually COVID has revealed that this system needs to be not just larger or smaller, but needs to be structured differently, and that's the kind of case where you might want to have more devolved powers.
My apologies, I think I didn't make my question clear. At the moment, a lot of the powers that we do have are not being used here in Scotland. DWP are still running, PIP, X, and all those things. Would it be your view that the full administration should be devolved to the new agency as soon as possible? Not new powers, just to get the existing ones actually delivered.
I think Siobhan Mathers is wanting to come in, so this might be an opportunity for Siobhan.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, it would be better if Scotland was actually using the powers that it had, but it's not just a matter of flipping a switch and magically the powers and all of the administration associated with them fall to the Scottish Government. It's hugely complex, and I would hope that the appropriate agencies are moving as quickly but as thoroughly as they can in order to transfer those powers.
Yeah. David Iser, do you want to add anything to that before we move on?
I don't really have anything to add. I mean, obviously it would be good if the transfer could happen sooner than has been outlined in the timetable, but the message from the government and Social Security Scotland is that increasing the pace of that transfer would bring unacceptable risks in relation to the sort of safety with which the administrative records can be transferred, and staff within the Scottish agency can administer those effectively without mistakes being made with claims. And I don't have any further insight into that, but that's the position. And of course, it would be better if it could happen sooner, but that doesn't seem to be possible. And it's probably better to take a precautionary approach at this stage than to try and rush things if there are significant risks there.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Before we move on,
I'm done. Thank you. I'm done.
Okay, now I had noticed that Mark Griffin has not had the opportunity to ask a question yet. Rachel, so tip Mark in, and then we'll come to yourself, Rachel, to finish off the questioning. Mark Griffin.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. When we're talking about the context of what the social security system can do to respond to the pandemic in the next few years, I wanted to talk about one particular form of assistance that has been devolved, and that is industrial injuries disablement benefit, which will then, given its new title, will be employment injury assistance, and that's for those who have been injured or contracted an illness at work. And I'm thinking particularly about the examples that we're hearing coming through of people who have contracted COVID at work and are now living with the consequences of a condition that's been described as long COVID, people struggling to breathe, struggling with mobility and fatigue for months and months after contracting COVID-19. And a lot of these people seem to be those in the health and care sector, retail sector, transport sector, people who have essentially kept us cared for, fed and moving through the pandemic. I just asked the panel's view on whether they think there is an opportunity with employment injuries assistance to support those who've contracted long COVID and how the social security system in that particular instance could respond to the pandemic in the coming years.
Any takers for that? David either? Should we start? I don't know if we want to start with, if you want us to start with you, David, but we'll start with you anyway. And if other witnesses could indicate in the chat box if they want to come in, that hopeful, David either.
It's an interesting question. I think I don't really have the answer as to whether the issue that has been described there would be something that would be best addressed through that particular benefit, as opposed to some of the other benefits that apply to people who can't work for various injury or illness type reasons. But I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
I see Tom Waters indicated. Tom?
Yeah, just one quick comment. It's not really answering kind of the full question. I guess the immediate thing that comes to mind is how easy it would be to show that you contracted COVID at work. And I guess that when that benefit was introduced, I think it was more kind of a standard physical injury at work was what was in mind. It would be very obvious that you got injured whilst you were doing your work. So I think that my initial reaction is that could be a key challenge. Is actually we don't really know. Did you get it at work? Did you get it when you were in the supermarket?
Okay, Mark, do you want to come back in?
No, I'm just looking for people's kind of early indication as to whether they think that would be an appropriate route to go down. It's got the opportunity there to cover injuries or illness, so I think it's something to look at.
But a real interesting question, Mark. Thank you very much. Rachel Hamilton?
Thanks, Bob. I just wondered if the panel's had any opinion on whether there should be a radical rethink on how devolved social security supports people here in Scotland. Anyone?
Siobhan Mathers, I think, is wanting to come in. Siobhan?
Yeah, in Reform Scotland would support a devolution of all social security powers to Scotland. It would simplify matters and give us the powers over everything rather than the sort of mishmash that currently exists, which even when the new powers are implemented, I don't think that settlement is going to last for very long because it is just overly complex and doesn't really quite stack up. So just devolve everything.
On that, Siobhan, I mean, obviously with your support for UBI and from Reform Scotland, it's not a case of flicking a switch and magically sort of creating a UBI system. We know that from the time it's taken for the devolved Social Security Scotland to be formed. Does Reform Scotland have a timescale, particularly in light of the policy the policy work that has been done on a UBI? Do you have a timescale looking at it now in a post-COVID world?
We haven't looked at a particular timescale for a post-COVID world. I totally agree that you can't just flip a switch on these things. However, what COVID has shown us is that government can respond more quickly in in a period of crisis. Within advocates of universal basic income, there are those who think that we should have pilots and look at which sort of schemes we should have. I'm more of the view that we're better to just move straight ahead and go with an overall scheme, because we could get bogged down for the next decade in doing various pilot schemes, and that's what's happened in various other countries. So I would be inclined to just push ahead as quickly as is practical.
I can see Tom Waters wants to come in on this. Tom?
Yeah, so the way I think about what COVID has raised in terms of the benefit system, I'd actually cast it in quite a different way. So the UK benefit system is very much focused on means-tested benefits. So people with low incomes and high needs, and compared to other developed countries, the UK is really quite unusual in that, in the sense that most or almost all other developed countries have so-called contributory benefits, where you're in work and you're kind of paying into the system, and then if you lose your job or you become disabled or something like that, you get higher benefits in virtue of the fact that you've been working for a while or paying in for a while. Now, what COVID reveals, because we only have a means-tested system, you can have someone who's actually kind of on quite high income, loses their job, and then is on the means-tested system and kind of sees a big decline in their income. Whereas in a contributory world, they would be more protected. And it's actually the furloughing scheme was precisely trying to create something more like a contributory system in real time, that the amount that you got was 80% of what you got before. It wasn't some fixed level. Now, whether or not you want to have more a means-tested system or a contributory system, there's a really big design questions. I think there's kind of good arguments on both sides. I think a universal basic income doesn't kind of connect to either of those things, in the sense that you wouldn't get any more if you're on a high income, then you lose your job, you don't get any more. So it's not kind of like a contributory system in that way once you fall out of work. And it also doesn't target benefit spending at the most needy, because by definition it gives the same amount to people across the income distribution. And so the big thing I think it reveals isn't universal basic income, but it's about contributory versus means-tested benefits. And as I say, the UK is very much at one extreme in the international context of that debate. And there might well be a good case for moving towards more of a contributory system. I think, that's certainly a much bigger question, but I think it's certainly COVID has raised that issue.
David, did you want to? Okay, I've just got another question, Bob, which is in reference to, again, looking to the future with how we can develop support for people who are vulnerable. In particular, I want to use the Scottish Welfare Fund as an example. And we heard evidence recently from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that she said that crisis grants weren't getting to people during COVID, and only 8% in Glasgow local authority got to these people. Now, these are people who, it's a short-term need, but my question really is, should we be looking at what is set in legislation in terms of the purpose of how the fund can be used, and actually open this up to allow local authorities to have more flexibility? And I know that the government work with COSLA, but I think that there is an argument there to ensure, and Tom, you mentioned it, to ensure that benefits get to people, which means actually devolving those even further. Has anyone got an opinion on that?
Thanks, Rachel. And Tom, you were mentioned there, but David I don't think the opportunity to win the last time, so why don't we see if David's got any comments, and then we can take Tom and Siobhan. Drop a note in the chat box if you want to come in on that. We'll take David first.
So is this specifically about the Scottish Welfare Fund and how it's
that was just an example, David. This is just about sort of how, the statute, it's set in statute, how those funds can be used. And I just wondered if it's an opportunity that we need to be allow local authorities to be more flexible in terms of, their contribution during COVID, which has very much shone a light on how local communities should be involved, and local authorities who have been delivering a lot of the crisis grants and the hardship funds recently. So it's really a question about further devolution.
I think it's very much dependent on circumstances. There are likely to be times when local authorities are best placed to deliver a particular type of support, but where on equity grounds, the government will want to have a degree of input into who is targeted by a particular fund and what the eligibility criteria might be. That said, there has to be a degree of autonomy and flexibility for local authorities in reflecting the specifics of needs in their areas. And if you don't allow that at all under any circumstances, then that seems to undermine the whole purpose of democratically elected local authorities. But I think it does depend on the specifics of the particular circumstance and the target group. And I don't think I have an answer to whether there's a general rule as to the extent to which these things should be legislated for, or local authorities have different degrees of discretion for.
And I think Siobhan might want to come in briefly here.
In terms of a general general philosophy in Reform Scotland, we believe that Scotland is over-centralised and that local authorities should have greater powers. And I think that this is a good example of where empowering local authorities, giving them more power and responsibility to respond to local needs, would indeed be appropriate.
Okay, Rachel.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. It might just be worth putting on the record that you mentioned Glasgow City Council, so that's something we can explore further, because Glasgow City Council is going to give evidence to the committee, I think, in a few weeks' time. I understand the Scottish Government's informed us that more flexibility has been given in relation to the Scottish Welfare Fund, so it will be very good to understand from a local authority point of view whether they think that discretion is enough, or do we have to put more in statute. So I think that's definitely a line of questioning, Rachel, that we can explore further with the local authorities once they join us. I don't have any other bids for questions just now. Time is upon us. Can I thank David Eisler, Siobhan Mathers and Tom Waters for your time, your significant time this morning in relation to this evidence session. Please do follow the committee diary, and through our clerks do get in contact with us if there's anything you think we should be considering that we're quite frankly not looking at. So I see members have put in the chat box they want to make sure that they'll extend their thanks to you. So we're very grateful for your input. That does conclude agenda item 2. We now move to agenda item 3, which is considering the evidence we've heard this morning in private session. So that I now close the formal public session of today's meeting, and I'll join MSPs in a private platform in a few moments. Okay, thank you, and thanks again.